And these are really important periods of the calf's life. Developmental plasticity, or that ability for that calf to change and be programmed, is really high at that time. If you increase growth and health during this critical window, you can improve overall production for lifetime.
Welcome to Rumination, the podcast that discusses and shares information that impacts the ruminant industry. Hi, I'm Chris Gwynn, your host. And today, Dr. Mike Steele, professor at the Ontario Agricultural College, Department of Animal Bioscience. He's an expert in dairy cattle physiology and nutrition. And he's got numerous awards, the Canadian Society of Animal Science Young Scientist Award, the Cargill Young Animal Nutritionist Award, the American Early Career Research Award, as well as Lallemand's Award of Excellence in Dairy Nutrition Research. His current research focuses on the mechanisms and control of gastrointestinal health and development in cattle, and he's published over 100 manuscripts. What you may not have known is Mike is a farm boy from Oxford County in Ontario. He's a longtime 4-H member, successful 4-H dairy judge, and a breeder of an all-American Holstein cow, Stelbro Renata Ranger. I remember her well. Before returning to academia, Dr. Steele spent several years as a commercial dairy nutritionist, combining what I remember, because he was a client of mine, his in-depth understanding of biology and physiology into practical farm-level nutrition, ration formulation, and dairy consulting. So welcome to Rumination, Mike. It's a pleasure to have you today.
Yeah, thanks very much, Chris. It's a pleasure to be here.
So we've known each other for a number of years. I believe the audience would really enjoy hearing about your journey as a young Oxford County dairy producer and all the way to an expert globally in calf and heifer research and as a university professor. So maybe you could expand a bit on that journey that you've taken, Mike.
Sure. I grew up in Oxford County in Ontario, Canada, and I've loved the dairy cow for my entire life. And I went to the University of Guelph thinking I was going to become a geneticist. And then I took fundamentals of nutrition and physiology, and that was it for me. I knew that that's where I wanted to focus. I still thought about dairy farming there for a while, but I think the drive for research brought me to a PhD at the University of Guelph as well. And I had the opportunity to work for private industry in between, before and after my PhD, which was really great for me. And I was lucky enough to have a position at the University of Alberta just over 8 years ago, and that's when I started my academic career. And I used to study transition cows and ruminal acidosis, but I switched about 8 years ago to primarily calf research. And it just so happens that's when my kids were born too, and I've become really fascinated with early life nutrition ever since that time. And I think that there's a lot of opportunity in the dairy industry to develop this area. So I love research. I love teaching. I'm very happy to, return back to Ontario from the University of Alberta and be here at the University of Guelph, where I've just been here for over 3 years. So Chris, I'm living the dream. I have the best job in the world. Being a professor is amazing, and I'm always surrounded by ideas and young people. So I'm very happy with where I am here as my career. But I do admit, I do miss milking cows, Chris.
Well, okay. I'm sure you can find a part-time job doing that, Mike. And you know what? And I've been involved in some of your classes, and I know from watching your students, you really respond to the way you approach, and certainly your recent adoption of using Kahoot in teaching really helps the team get inspired. And so early development of young animals, it's an amazing booming field, I think. And so I noticed and was reading a recent paper that you were a co-author, where you highlighted several key windows of developmental programming opportunity that exists in young and developing ruminants, in which perhaps managing nutrition, whether it's in utero, all the way up to calving, can contribute to the development of those calves and those heifers, and ultimately improved milk production, efficiency, and health. And I'd really appreciate you expanding a bit more on that paper, if you could.
Sure. Yeah, our focus of calf research over the last 50 years has been on colostrum feeding and milk feeding, a little bit on weaning as well. And these are really important periods of the calf's life. Developmental plasticity, or that ability for that calf to change and be programmed, is really high at that time. And we've been shown that in a wide variety of research experiments that if you increase growth and health during this critical window, you can improve overall production for a lifetime. So that has really inspired our lab to dig a little bit deeper into this area. And now we're kind of expanding into the prenatal period. So before that calf is born, there's a lot of programming that's happening. We want to learn more about how feeding the dam impacts the calf, and also following these animals for their entire life. I think that's another critical hole that we need to fill in calf research. We just kind of stop at 60 days and we don't follow them. And I think that's a critical piece to understand how this early life interventions or early life nutrition can impact lifetime performance.
No, it is fascinating, and I'm glad yourself and your team are championing that. Focusing maybe a bit more on that kind of that pre-weaning and weaning period, just to dig down a little deeper, because I think it's been a traditional area of perhaps concern and opportunity. What's your research that you've been able to review shown that we should be doing differently today, say on the farm, to enhance performance and minimize stress during those periods?
Yeah, I think it all starts on the first day of life with colostrum. Okay. I think a lot of our research has shown that some of the recommendations even we have today are still not ideal. From the day of feeding 100 grams of IgG and colostrum in that first meal, that was 10 years ago. Now we're at 150. Some people are saying 200. I think our lab has produced a lot of results saying that it's actually double that. So I think we have still a lot to learn with respect to colostrum management. And also that transition from colostrum to milk that's happening in that first week of life. I think that's something that we've really focused on a lab, just showing what that does to the calf with respect to health and gut function. And that's really the focus of a lot of our colostrum work. And then in the pre-weaning area, we've been looking at a lot with respect to milk feeding planes and feeding higher levels of milk. And then finishing that with, okay, if you're going to feed these high levels of milk, how are you going to wean them so that they still maintain growth during this weaning process? So we've done a lot of experiments looking at feed composition, but most importantly, weaning age, and as well as step-down programs is what our lab has really focused on. And I guess the take-home message here is that you can feed a lot of milk as long as your weaning strategy is sound, and you should be weaning later in life and more gradual if you are feeding more milk, to make sure that that growth advantage that you receive through feeding more milk doesn't go away. So those are some of the key findings in our lab over the last 6-7 years, but definitely every topic we can dissect, and there's all kinds of new findings within each one.
Oh, fascinating. And earlier you talked about, I think, intestinal development, gut health development, and in the colostrum period, as well as probably the weaning transition. And so wondering whether you could expand a bit more on that and the development and physiology of the rumen and lower gut during these transition periods.
Absolutely. Maintaining really proper gut health is critical for this calf. So if you look at the morbidity and mortality, it's really stemming from gastrointestinal dysfunction and pathogenic diarrhea. So anything we can do to improve the gastrointestinal microbial community as well as the health and barrier function can have a positive impact on this calf. So we've been looking at different colostrum feeding strategies like extended colostrum feeding, looking at different milk compositions, really focusing on fatty acid composition within the milk as well as lactose concentrations to see how that impacts gastrointestinal health. But it looks like some of the things that we were doing just naturally in management, like an abrupt transition from colostrum to a whole milk, or feeding milk replacers that are really high in lactose, could actually stimulate some gut dysfunction during this pre-weaning period. So I think some of our recent research has really challenged some of the dogma that we have in our industry of how to feed a calf in the first day of life and even during this entire pre-weaning period.
No, fascinating. It's always important to challenge dogma, right? Because interesting about fatty acids, is that something you can expand a bit on?
Yeah, it all started doing some experiments looking at gut permeability, or leaky gut is something our lab studies a lot of. We just want to make sure that, in some cases it's actually okay to have a leaky gut, but when you have a lot of dysfunction, it becomes a little bit too much and it causes inflammation. So we did a study where we looked at feeding levels of fat, and we realized that if you elevate a level of fat in a milk replacer, you're going to be increasing gut permeability. And then we started looking at fatty acid composition within milk replacer, and we noticed some striking differences in some formulas. Not all formulas, but some formulas are very different. And we've been showing relationships between the fatty acid composition and gut function. So that's our focus of research. In addition, these fats are really bioactive and can actually change the metabolism of the calf as well. So those are the two areas, gut function and metabolism, that we're trying to determine how different fatty acids that we feed this animal, even in colostrum actually, that's another focus that we're on, and also during the pre-weaning period, can impact overall health and function and metabolism of these animals.
Oh, fascinating. So we look forward to seeing some of the results of those research coming out to stimulate both changes at the farm level, but also new areas of research. So keep up the good work. So as we kind of come to the conclusion of today's podcast, Mike, are there some key take-homes you'd like to share with our audience who are nutritionists, dairy producers, veterinarians, researchers?
Yeah, I think just don't underestimate the investment of nutrition and management during the early life stages of this calf, and make sure that you're making proper measurements on your farm. And I think the value of knowing your average daily gain, especially during the pre-weaning period, is a really great first step for most farmers. So, if there's any way that you can convince Chris Gwynn to weigh your calves on a weekly basis, I think you should go for it. But if you can make arrangements with your own staff, I really highly encourage you at home to understand your average daily gains and use that as a good metric of the health and performance of your calves. Because without that number, you can't really say anything, in my opinion. So work with your vets and your nutritionists and try to get those values.
And of course, coming back to some of the things you mentioned about colostrum feeding and what you're finding and the transition milk, those could be some things that could be practically implemented today, right?
Oh, absolutely. So I think just feeding as much colostrum as the calf can consume is the takeaway. But if you're limited through economics, then I would be shooting for over 200 grams, but even closer to 300 grams of immunoglobulins. Making sure you have a gradual transition from that colostrum to a whole milk or a milk replacer. Feeding a lot of milk and milk replacer in the first 3 to 4 weeks is what I would recommend, because they don't consume starter, at least enough starter to grow. And then having this really gradual and late weaning program on farm. So after 8 weeks of life, and trying to have a step down program of close to 2 weeks or even longer. I think those would be my big take-home messages for your audience today.
No, that's great. It's fascinating, and always a pleasure to catch up with you, Mike, and understand what's going on in your lab and the new practical research that you're delivering. So thanks. So before we wind up, any other key things you'd like to share?
I encourage you. I hope that things open up in the future. It looks like we're moving this direction, and we'll be reaching out to the community here at the University of Guelph to showcase some of the things we're doing here. It's a really special time at the University of Guelph, and especially for not only calf research but everything that we're doing. Yeah. So we're really looking forward to reaching out to and showing everyone in the future, maybe even having more conferences on campus and more interaction with producers in the future.
No, we all look forward to that. So thanks for those comments, Mike. And so thank you again for your time. And I want to thank also our audience for taking the opportunity to listen to us today. And so that you don't miss our next episode of Rumination Podcast, you can find us at our website, jefo.ca, on Apple and Google Podcasts, as well as Spotify. This podcast was brought to you by Jefo Nutrition, precision nutrition for a growing world. And have a great day.